Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to LCHA's Renters 101 series of workshops. Today, we're going to be focusing on credit. My name is Liz Warning, and I am the manager of Housing Counseling Programs, as well as a HUD-certified housing counselor with the Lake County Housing Authority. On the left over here is a list of the services offered by the Housing Counseling Department, all of which is provided at no cost to all residents, regardless of income, demographic, or your residency. The link at the bottom there will direct you to our intake form. So if you would like to sign up for one-on-one counseling services. Just a reminder, everyone is going to be muted until we get to the Q&A session, but if you do have a question, please feel free to type it in the chat. If we can answer you right away, we will do so, but if not, we'll take everybody's concerns at the end of the presentation. All right, today's session is going to review three basic topics. First, we're going to set the foundation by discussing the real basics of credit. So basically why we use the system we do, changes in the industry, how your credit is constructed, and then the laws that protect you. After that, we're going to move into the more exciting piece, analysis of your individual report. I'm going to explain how to read this kind of confusing document and how to identify the parts that need repair, and then how to gain access to it in the future. And then after that, lastly, we're going to talk about using those two pieces of information as a tool to create credit repair or credit growth, or a plan for ourselves for their future. All right, so let's begin with the basics. Why do we have a credit score, and what does it reflect? To begin, we need to note there's a difference between our credit scores and the actual credit report, right? So the report itself is a repository of all your information, and it's protected under the federal laws, which we're going to go over in a little bit. The score itself is a 3-digit number whose entire purpose is to add a numeric value to each line of the data in your report, and then combine those values to predict what kind of financial risk you pose to a lender. So the report itself, you can get to that, you can access it for free through a variety of sources, whereas the score itself is a proprietary product. So that's owned by a couple of companies and therefore has to be paid for when you want access. The score and the report do not take into consideration a couple of things like a person's age, address, their employment, income, race, gender, or any other protected class. They are quite simply raw data and then a numeric representation of that data into that 3-digit score. Okay, access to your report or information within the report is protected by a couple of federal laws. For today's workshop, we're going to focus on the Big 10 rights under the 1970s Fair Credit Reporting Act, or what's called the FCRA. So don't fall asleep. I know it's going to be a little intense. You're never going to have to know this law by heart. Just remember that you are protected by a federal law, and the federal law gives you the following rights, right? So number one, if information or data found in your credit report or another type of consumer report was the reason you were denied an application for a job or a home or credit or insurance or what have you, or if that data was to be used to take adverse action against you, the person or the agency who denied you based on that data must inform you and give you the name, the address, and the phone number of the agency who provided that information, right? You have the right to access all the information about yourself in the file of a consumer reporting agency. So that you should know there's many consumer reporting agencies. It's not just the 3 bureaus. So no matter what that reporting agency is, you have the right to access that data. Everyone is entitled to a free credit report per year, each of the 3 bureaus, but also you have the right to a free report if a person or an agency, a housing provider, a credit agency, lender, something like that, has taken adverse action against you because of the information in your report. So as well as if you are the victim of identity theft, or maybe you need to correct the information because of fraud, or even if you are on public assistance and are trying to repair yourself, or you are unemployed and expected to apply for employment within the next 60 days. There's also some provisions about credit report access that were associated with the COVID pandemic. But those circumstances that I just listed that would allow you free access, those will always be the case. So even after the COVID pandemic protections end, those will still be in existence, right? All right, well, number 3, you have the right to dispute incorrect or incomplete data in the file. If you report it to the Consumer Reporting Agency, whatever that reporting agency is, including the 3 credit bureaus, that agency must investigate and accept if your dispute is frivolous. So obviously, if it has no merit or if you're just doing it to be petty, they don't have to necessarily correct it. Of course, they're not going to correct incorrect information. So after they verify, after the bureau or the reporting agency verifies that that data is incorrect, or it's incomplete or unverifiable, that reporting agency has to pull it off the report. They have to remove it. Obviously, again, if they determine the information is correct, if it's accurate, they continue to report. Still, that agency is not allowed to report negative information that is more than 7 years old, or bankruptcies that are more than 10 years old, which we'll discuss in a much later slide. Number 6, Consumer Reporting Agency must provide information about you only when a person has a valid need for that information. So they're just not spreading this around, right? So what's a valid need? A valid need could be a credit application, insurance application, employment application, if it's your landlord or a business loan, something like that. Typically, that means that you are going to have to sign off on their access to them. So obviously, if you're taking out a loan, you have a dozen or so forms that you have to sign. Same thing with a rental application, same thing with employment, etc. Likewise, an employer is required to get from you a very specific authorization to pull your file, and that is before or during employment. So even if they never asked you before you became employed and they want to pull it now, they have to give you that form to sign today. So before or during employment, they have to ask for that very specific authorization. We always advise our clients, if you're getting a job offer and you have an employee handbook that you've been offered to you, read through it thoroughly, make sure that the thing you're signing is something you agree with. Always read before you sign, right? The terms of the employment and the credit pull are going to be within whatever documentation they provide you. Okay, number 8. You can limit your pre-screened offers, right? So pre-screened offers don't affect your credit, but they're a pain in the butt. And they also open you up to potential identity theft, right? So you can actually opt out of those pre-screened offers and prevent your name from being on the millions of lists that are out there. So to do that, you can go to optoutprescreen.com, optoutprescreen.com. I'll put it in the chat later on, but you can just go to optoutprescreen.com. We're moving on to number 9, you can also request a freeze on your credit. It's another protection, right? So a security freeze or a fraud alert is something that can be placed on your credit report, not your credit score, your credit report. And this is going to prevent an agency from releasing that information in your credit report without lifting or removing that freeze. So this is designed to prevent credit loan services from being approved in your name without consent. So if somebody has access to your data, they're not going to be able to make those loans, sign up those documents without your consent, right? However, if you do have that security freeze on your account, you are not able to access those future loans. You're not able to apply for anything without removing that. So if you're going to be looking for that employment, if you're going to be applying for that auto loan, make sure that's in the back of your mind that you do have to lift that security freeze before doing so, or else it's a moot point. All right, so lastly, number 10, and I promise you will move on. You do have a right to your credit score itself, but you have to pay for it. Again, the credit score is a proprietary product. It's not something that is provided for free. So someone has to pay for it. Maybe it's not you, maybe it's through your bank or your lender or your housing counseling agency, but that is not something that is for free. Someone has to pay for it. It is a product. Okay, moving on. FICO scores. Like we said, Your credit score can be made available to you by lenders, certain agencies like LCHA, but in order to do so, the scores have to be purchased. We just said it's a product, it has to be purchased from Fair Isaac and Company, which is of course FICO. FICO is Fair Isaac and Co. Why is this, right? The algorithm used to generate your score is owned by Fair Isaac and Co. by FICO. And that's how they make their money, right? They make their money by making folks pay $30 a pop to access one of those 3 scores, sometimes all of those 3 scores. Sometimes it's more than $30. There are other organizations that have attempted to create new, similar algorithm-based credit scores in like a scoring system. The most widely of those is called Vantage. It's considered a competitor to FICO. So Vantage is not used by lenders. Vantage score is most often accessed through your bank or through the app Credit Karma. Credit Karma is actually owned by Vantage. It doesn't make it good or bad that it's not used by lenders, but the truth is that Vantage scores, because they use a different algorithm and because they're not commonly used by lenders, what's going to happen is your Vantage score may be different than a FICO score. And again, that's not good or bad. It's a wonderful way of tracking where you are as far as progressing towards repairing your credit. It's also a great way of accessing for free your report data, but just know that your Vantage score will not be the same as your FICO score, that a lender across the board, a lender, whether it's an auto loan or a credit loan, or especially mortgage, will not be using your Vantage score. And therefore, if you're just on the precipice between not able to get a loan and able to get a loan, then it's likely that your Vantage score is not going to be very trustworthy. So access your FICO score if you're trying to get a loan. Vantage score is perfectly wonderful if you just want to track your progress or if you want to access what's in the report itself. So again, it doesn't really matter what your score is. The access to the report itself is free for everybody, and the data in the report is the same no matter what. Okay, one of the pieces of information on the past screen was that you don't really have 3 scores, you have more than 50. And that is because, and this is FICO, that is because FICO models that there have been around since the 50s have changed frequently. So depending on the lender, depending on the FICO model, your score could vary anywhere from a couple of points to a few dozen points, right? So the different FICO models exist to offer a more specific representation of an individual's payment history to the specific lender. So for example, FICO, and this screen, what it shows is kind of a breakdown of what FICO models are used across the industry for which lending purpose, right? So for example, FICO 9, the auto model, looks more at your credit balance and how much of that credit is used over time. But it also minimizes the impact of medical collection debt, right? So most of our clients come here looking to either repair their score, but they're doing it for the eventuality of purchasing a house, right, to get a mortgage. So when applying for a mortgage, most commonly used FICO model today are going to be 2, 5, and 4. This is also what LCHA uses when we pull your individual report and when we do credit counseling. So though 2, the 5, and the 4 models were released so many years ago, they're ideal for mortgage lending because they are the strictest. So they have the strictest parameters, the strictest requirements, right? For all other types, most frequently what is used is the FICO model 8. So FICO 8, commonly used for most types of loans. So this one was released in 2009, and it was designed so frequent late payments and maintaining high balances on your credit card became the most important influential factors. So you'll see FICO 8 used when a lender is advertising their car loans, or if they're advertising especially credit cards. You'll see it on their front page of their website, for example. And again, FICO 8 is that model because that is the one that is most impactful if you're applying for credit, right? It's going to look at your maintaining high balances and lates. Okay, so that being said, everything today that we're going to be talking about from here on out is going to be assuming that the FICO score you're pulling is going to be FICO 8. Again, it's the most commonly used. All right, let's move forward. So you're going to see a lot of these charts today. Forgive me in advance. Like, God, I love charts. But effectively, for every type of credit data that we're going to be discussing, there's going to be like a one of these bar charts, and then of course a pie chart. So, all right. Now that being said, I stole this from FICO, right? You might know that your credit score is going to be a number anywhere from 300 all the way to 850, right? So, a larger number you have, the less likely you have been in the past to default. So you look super duper. Higher the number, the better the credit history. The credit score itself is designed to represent the amount of risk, right? Risk is the biggest word. There's no morality attached to it. This is not an ethics thing. It literally represents our history of interacting with credit, no more, no less. And when I say history, I don't mean ancient history, of course, because our credit file includes what we've been up to for the past 30 to 60 days. As far as the credit bureaus are concerned, everything we do regarding credit or debt represents some sort of trend, right? A trend in our actions and our behaviors towards default or away from default. All right, here's the great pie chart, right? So everyone's seen this pie chart. This is our 5 predictive characteristics. Basically, it's the breakdown of our credit scores, how each of our behaviors affect the credit score. And again, we're talking about pure behavior, pure data, no morality attached to it, just pure data, right? So as you can see, the 2 most prominent and influential characteristics that affect that score are going to be our history of paying on time and our utilization rate, which is also called the outstanding debts. The remainder of the mix is made up of how long you've had certain lines of credit, what your blend of credit is, how many times in the past 12 months you've attempted to open new lines of credit. Again, those are all just behaviors, nothing moral attached to it, just exactly our behaviors. Again, what is not considered in any of those factors is that list of protected classes: your age, your employment, your income, your race, your gender, religious affiliation, political party, what's on your social media accounts, your family size, your marital size, any other protected anything, right? That's not going to have any influence on anything. All right, let's take a look at these in more depth. And we're going to start off with that biggest one, that payment history, number 1, right? A lot of the time, the category is kind of reduced down to, do you pay your bills on time, right? Okay, that's fine. And that's, yes, that is a huge component of payment history. The actual score is affected more subtly than that. So for example, the credit score itself is going to be affected by the severity of and how recently your delinquencies have been. So how extreme the delinquency was, how recent the delinquency was. The best possible situation is that you have no delinquencies over the past 7 to 10 years, depending, right? Having no delinquencies over the past 7 years generate the most credit points towards your score, right? So we're moving towards good behavior. And if you've had no delinquencies in the past 7 years, that is going to generate the most points added to your baseline score. Granted, that's not always going to be the case. We're going to have something in our history maybe, but the rule of thumb is the longer it has been since those delinquencies were recorded, the less impact they're going to have on your score. It's also true that even one delinquency can affect your score. Absolutely. But really the pattern of delinquency across several trend lines especially is going to create the larger problem. So how recently and how severe, again, these delinquencies have been is going to affect your score over time. And, you know, when we talk about what do you mean by frequently, what do you mean by recently, severity, we're talking, you know, the past 30 days versus the past 90 days, even as much as that can be less impactful, 90 days versus 30 days. Okay, so ideally we're never going to have late payments, but if you do, it's better for your score to have one from 7 years ago than from the last 30 days. Okay, here's another pie chart. Here's another bar chart. So again, we're going to look at just the risk of it, right? So as you can see, because your risk of default is the highest, and this is through the lender's eye, the risk of default is the highest in the months right after you are late on your payment. that is when your credit score is going to take its biggest hit. That's why it's plausible to see your credit score drop by up to 100 points if you are 30 days late for the first time. So, you know, I had a 600 credit score. I've never been late. Bam, I was late once. Now it's down to 500. Granted, over the time, the impact of that late payment is going to be reduced, especially if you make your payments on time, right? Because the risk model that FICO uses views you as less of a potential for default than you were in those first 30 days. So basically, this is a trust issue. Once the trust is broken, it's hard to rebuild, and it takes time, consistency, good behavior, just like all relationships. And then lastly, I think it's important to say that when we talk about making payments on time, what we are saying is not you need to pay the entire credit card off or what have you, because there really is no benefit to that. The credit lender expects you to pay the minimum payment on time. So yes, it would be ideal to pay off all of your debt every time, all the time, and I highly recommend it if you can. But the lender or the credit card company, whoever, is literally only sending a yes or no answer to the credit bureaus that you are paying the amount they expect from you. So in this case, in many people's case, that is the minimum monthly payment. There are credit cards that require you to pay off the entirety every month, but for most credit lines, it is what is your minimum payment that you are required to pay off every month? Did this person pay that? Yes or no? And another way to look at this is if it was a mortgage payment, right? So yes, it'd be great if you could pay your mortgage payment and a little more every month, but that's not what the mortgager is going to expect. They're going to expect you to pay your mortgage payment, what is required of you every month. The mortgage company is only going to report to the bureau that if you did not pay that mortgage, they're not going to report to the bureau, congratulations, you paid a little extra. All right, moving on. So next impactful category, next most impactful category is going to be outstanding debts we have, right? So this is called, typically in our industry, it's called utilization. What's your utilization? But basically that translates into how much of the credit available to you are you going to currently be using? So for example, if you have a credit card limit of $100 and you use $20 you have $20 to when the credit card reports to the bureaus, right? That means your utilization is 20%. You have 20% utilization because you use $20 out of 100. Easy peasy. So what is important to understand in that sentence is the date that the lender reports it to the credit bureau. Why is that important? Most people do not know when that is. Sometimes that's going to be the invoice date, the due date, etc. If you are a person that makes multiple payments per month, I'm one of those people. I pay off my credit card once a week instead of one large payment. So the lender or your credit company is only going to tell the bureau what is owed on the day they report. They're not going to say, good job, Liz, you pay 4 times a month versus 1 month. They're going to say, on the date we report to the credit bureau, this is your utilization. This is the dollar amount that's owed. So that's super duper if you know what day that your credit card reports to the bureaus. But if you don't know what date your lender reports to the bureaus, it's wise to keep your utilization as low as possible, because again, it's very rare that we know what that date is that they're going to report to the credit bureaus. Okay, this is another chart, another example of how a lender is going to see your risk, right? We always keep talking about risk, and therefore be more or less likely to extend your line of credit. So as you can see, the lower your utilization is, the lower your risk of default. This is just data. There's no morals to it, right? So using all the credit available to you, even if it is paid off every month indicates to the lender that you are a high risk of default versus utilizing a very small amount every month, even if it is paid off, indicates a low risk of default. Okay, moving on to the next category, which is length of credit history. So we've been discussing that all credit is a numerical value that just indicates trust in the individual, right? So a great amount of this has to do with your patterns over time, specifically if a lender has previously terminated your line of credit. So one way to indicate that you are stable and you're a long-term client without defaults or credit closures is that all of your trade lines have been open for a long period of time. FICO itself looks at the age of your accounts on average, so not individually. So what does that mean? That means if you have a trade line that's been open for 10 years and you open up a new line of credit on your account, the average age of your trade lines is going to shrink, right? Average. The lender is also going to look at how long it's been since you opened up the majority of these trade lines. So a large amount of recent trade lines is going to indicate to the lender an odd pattern of behavior, which is just red flag central, just sends up a bunch of red flags. So the only time that this is not the case is with a brand new credit file, such as a credit file owned by a very young person, or maybe you started your credit after years of activity, or maybe you just didn't get your credit started until you were in your mid-30s or what have you, right? So new credit file, that's the only time where credit length of history doesn't impact it as great. Another bar chart for you. So as you can see from this chart, the longer you've had a particular trade line, the less of a risk you are to the lender. And just like the other two categories, your credit score indicates a level of trust. And the only way to build trust is with time. All right, which leads us, of course, to the fourth category, which is the pursuit of new credit. Like I said in the previous slide, a new trade line has the potential to decrease your score immediately after it opens the account. So that's because it increases the number of new accounts to have been opened within the last 12 months. New accounts indicate new behavior, and the three bureaus like to see consistent long-term behavior, good patterns, consistent patterns, rather than new unpredictable behavior. And I know I keep speaking as if three credit bureaus are human beings, but please let's remember we're talking about an algorithm here. It's basically a computer program. It's basically a robot. We're not talking about people. Nobody's judging anybody. But getting back to the actual content, the worst possible red flag for your score is if you have applied, and especially if you've been denied for multiple lines of credit within the last 12 months. We are going to discuss in a couple of slides how to avoid having your credit score impacted by multiple applications all at once, and then how much time it takes for that to be removed from your credits. Here's our bar graph again. This one shows the impact of how a new credit file is impacted versus a mature credit file, so old versus young. Obviously, if your credit file is more established, you've had credit for a long time, versus a person who has a youthful credit file, a more established line of credit is not going to impact as much as it affects young files with not as many trade lines. All right, and then of course, last we have the blend of credit types. So as you know, there are more than a few types of credit lines, right? So there are three basic types. You've got installments, revolving, and open-ended. Most accounts can be shoehorned into those three categories, right? So installment credit is a loan, which you borrow a big old lump of sum and you repay it with interest, right? They have fixed payments. They have an end date, so you're moving towards a horizon. Once a installment credit loan is paid off in its entirety, the account is closed and it stays on your credit file for 7 years until, as a closed account, right? So an example could be a mortgage or an auto loan, a personal loan, a student loan, anything that has a horizon that you're aiming towards, a fixed rate, not a fixed rate, a fixed payment every month, and the date that it will close. A revolving line is one where you borrow and you pay it from a certain line of credit up to a maximum limit, right? So you are the one in control over how much you borrow and of course how much you need to pay back. And then interest itself is charged on any balance remaining after the statement is due. So it's possible with those kind of lines that you avoid paying interest altogether if you pay off every month. With those, as long as you pay your payments on time, the account will remain open indefinitely. So those trade lines never close unless you close them or the lender closes them. And those are commonly credit cards typically, but also home equity line of credits are considered revolving. If for anybody who has a HELOC. And then of course the third is called an open line of credit, which is unique in that the monthly payments vary from month to month, but balances are always due at the end of the cycle. So with these, you're expected to pay the entire bill within a certain number of days after receiving it. A good example of this is your electricity bill, right? So that's an open credit account, which is why your utilities show up on your credit report, right? In that situation, you spend as much as you spend in electricity, you're expected to pay it off within a certain period of time. And that could be any utilities from your water, your cell, your ComEd bill, your what have you. Those are all open lines of credit. So a lender wants to see a good blend of these, right? A good example is going to have, like, let's say a nicely blended credit file is going to have an auto loan or a personal loan, which are installments, or maybe a mortgage, which is an installment, a credit card, which is a revolving line, or maybe a couple. And then of course your utilities, all of those represented on your credit report. It's even better if you have major credit cards like a Visa or MasterCard, in addition to store credit cards like a Kohl's card or a JCPenney card. A Kohl's card or a JCPenney card, a store card, is what's called restricted revolving credit, because of course you can't take your Kohl's card and use it at Jewel-Osco. You have to use it at Kohl's. Another great way of getting a little credit boost is to have your landlord or your utility company report your payments to the bureaus every month. All right. So let's double back to the idea of what is an inquiry, what is not, what is one, right? So a few slides ago, I said that when we discussed the pursuit of new credit and how we have time to apply for new credit before our scores start to fall. Basically, there's a methodology to applying for credit where it's going to avoid our scores plummeting all at once, right? So this is largely dependent on what FICO views as an inquiry for credit versus a promotional inquiry or an account review. So a hard inquiry is one that is designed to result in a line of credit. The whole intent is the line of credit, right? That's the ultimate goal. So maybe this is a student loan, maybe this is an auto loan or mortgage, etc. These have the greatest potential to impact your credit scores, though of course that impact is going to fade over time if you are rejected for that credit line. A soft inquiry is not the same. So a soft inquiry does not affect your credit score. These include those obnoxious pre-authorizations. These include those things that you get in the mail, or when your employer looks at your credit with your authorization, or like an agency like ours that pulls your credit to do education. So, you know, when you are effectively looking at your score for a review versus the intent of getting the credit line. So to review, all inquiries, hard, soft review from the past 12 months will show up on your credit report. So if we pull your credit, it'll show up as Lake County Housing Authority. It might even have my name on it because that's who the account owner is. But only those hard inquiries will affect the score. Okay, so once FICO has determined that your inquiry is a hard or a soft or a inquiry, they will now look at it in those terms, right? So you are now, it's been established that this is a hard inquiry or a pursuit of new credit, right? The inquiry deduplication rule takes effect. Let's call it the dedupe rule. And again, this is not something you're going to need to know apart from what basically you're protecting. You don't have to know the terminology because dedupe is a ridiculous term, but you do need to know that you are protected, right? So this is how it goes. According to FICO, the addition of any inquiry to your credit report lowers your score, right? 5 points or fewer. In the past, people who were rate shopping for like a mortgage or an auto loan, what was going to happen is that it resulted in a bunch of hard inquiries, which of course reduced your score. So if you had 50 hard inquiries in one day, or even in 30 days, your score would drop by 100 points, and that's purposeless, right? So that's where we get 30-day buffer or dedupe rule, the inquiry deduplication rule. So this sets in to help FICO doing its job of predicting future risk. I know it sounds cruel, but it really isn't. Like, FICO isn't trying to protect you. They're trying to make it more efficient so they can predict future risk. So it does benefit us as consumers, but it really is for FICO's benefit. Okay, so first, the loan inquiries within the past 30 days are ignored entirely by this FICO scoring formula. This means that when your lender does that one last credit check before closing, neither the inquiry resulting from that credit check nor the loan inquiries incurred during the prior 30 days are considered in that score. So what happens if it's older than 30 days, right? So if it's older than 30 days, typically inquiries that are made within a 45-day block of time of each other impact your score as if there were one inquiry. So 30 days, no impact. 45 days, one impact. So one impact means maybe it reduces your score by a couple of points, 12 points, 15 points, etc. So the number of days that make up this dedupe period can vary according to the version of the FICO score that you're using. That's why we talked about how there's so many different FICO models, right? And the newest version, which is FICO 10, uses the 45 days, and the very oldest models, the FICO 2, uses 14 days. So that is why it's so important to really get all of your applications in a very short period of time. If you're applying for a mortgage, if you're applying for an auto loan, it's absolutely important to get it in as close as time, because really, do you know if they're using FICO 2 or FICO 10 or FICO 8, etc.? Do you have that 45-day period of time? Do you have only a 14-day window for your credit score not to be impacted so greatly? The other thing it's important to note is the dedupe rule does not apply to credit cards, because unlike a mortgage or an auto loan, where really you're only going to have one house at the end of it, you're really going to have one car at the end of it. You can have tons of credit cards. So FICO looks at that as each individual credit application is going to reduce your score by the full impact, which of course reduces over time, but you will take the full hit of applying to multiple credit cards, no matter what period of time you apply for them. So why do they care, right? So the FICO cares about how many applications you're putting in, because their research indicates that consumers who have 5 or more inquiries within the past 12 months are 6 times as likely to become 90 days past due. That's a lot of numbers, but basically the overview is this. Their research has indicated that a person who is applying for a great number of credit cards within 12 months, or a great number of trade lines is important, are at a higher risk of default than other folks. And again, this all comes down to risk or trust. I know it's kind of the theme of today's workshop, but risk or trust, the less risky FICO perceives you to be, the more trust they have in you, and it's more likely that the lender is going to offer you a line of credit. Okay. Before we move on, I want to show you something that's admittedly I'm kind of nerdy about, but I also stole from some FICO training that they provided us with. I just think it's fascinating. So this focuses on our trade lines by themselves impact our score in addition to behavioral patterns, right? So like I said, this slide represents a number of points associated with trade lines, which is then added to the points assigned to certain behaviors. So obviously, if this chart represented the entirety of our credit score, all of us would max out at 345, because that's what those numbers added up to, which we know is not the case, right? So unfortunately, FICO is not going to hand me over their proprietary algorithm, because they love that I spend $30 on each client to give them. They just like that money so much, and they're not going to let me duplicate it. But nevertheless, so they're not going to hand me over their algorithm, but this is a good representation of how a person can build credit using what they consider to be the ideal circumstances. Even if we start out at 300, 600, what have you, you can add to that credit score using these guidance. Okay. So if we're looking at our payment histories, obviously we want to make sure that we have no serious delinquencies in the credit file over the past 7 years, right? If you do have delinquencies, it's best to have them over 2 years in the past, with the impact fading on time, right? So that's going to be right here up at the top where it says no serious delinquencies. That's the ideal, right? With outstanding debts, we want to make sure that we have not 0 trade lines, but no more than 6 to 7. So a couple of trade lines, you can have 1 or 6 outstanding trade lines over the past couple of years, but no more than 6 or 7. The best way possible to earn as many points on our credit report as we can is to have those trade lines over 4 years old. right? So when we look at credit history length, that's when we hit the sweet spot. So if you have trade lines over 4 years old, or you're approaching that 4-year history, expect a jump in your credit report based on the trade line age. And then the best way to maximize your points from pursuit of new credit is to limit the amount of credit cards you've inquired about over the past 6 months. So if you look at that, obviously the maximum number of points you can get is contingent on you not applying for credit cards in the past 6 months, or trade lines of credit in the past 6 months. And then lastly, when we look at credit mix, we want to make sure our file includes each one of the trade lines. That's number 3. So trade lines, each type of credit, right? So your installments, revolving, and then an open-ended line of credit. That'll give you the maximum number of points. Okay, so we're going to move on to reading the report. Now that we know how our credit is constructed, we're going to try to tackle the most confusing part, which is looking at our own report and actually digesting it. And then again, if you have questions about your specific report, we can either look at them one-on-one if you don't want to share them in the chat, but there will be a Q&A point at the end of this session. Okay, so it is important to know right off the bat that you and I are probably going to be looking at different credit reports. If you get them from your bank, or if you get them from annualcreditreport.com, which is the free federal site, by the way, annualcreditreport.com, it's going to be formatted very differently. And that's because there's many companies that buy from the bureaus, and basically their whole thing is to present to lenders and folks like the housing counseling agencies. They present it in a format that is readable, that's legible, right? But they all have different formats. So what you're looking at might be a little bit confusing. However, they all have the exact same data because they're legally required to. So your data is going to be the same. It's just how it's represented is going to be a little different. So you have 4 basic sections. You've got personal identifying information, your account history, your public records, and your inquiries. The first of this, number 1 is going to be your personal identifying information. That includes your name, your address, social security number, date of birth. Sometimes it includes employment information, and this is not used on your FICO score. So it's still important to have this information correct, but it is not included in your FICO score, right? So here's the fun thing about this is to remember that you supply this information. So the individual consumer supplies the information that ends up on your credit report. So, garbage in, garbage out, make sure you always provide the accurate information and consistent information. So my first name is Elizabeth, but I more frequently go by Liz. But let's face it, Elizabeth can be Lizzie, it can be Liz, it can be Betty, it can be Elizabeth. So if I use my consistent identifying information across the board, I'll have nothing to update on my credit file later on. For the record, though, you can update this information, and I would highly advise making sure that your personal identifying information is accurate on your credit reports. And you can do that by contacting the 3 credit bureaus and say, please delete this, please delete that, please make sure everything says this or that. So if I want to be represented as Elizabeth warning across the board, I'm going to delete everything that says Lizzie or Liz or Betty or what have you. And just make sure it's consistently one piece of information. Okay, so sometimes employment history can be included in the personal information section. You can do a dispute on this, by the way. You can say, I want this outdated information to be gone. You can delete old employers. You can add missing employers. It's certainly not necessary. Again, this doesn't impact your score, but there is a certain theory that says, the more accurate information is on your credit report, the less likely it is for you to be confused with all the other Elizabeth warnings out there. And certainly when you do data checks later on, the last thing you want to happen is some other person with your name mistakenly found its way onto your report because you had a spelling error or something like that. So again, the more accurate information, the better. Okay, as you can see, personal identifying information section doesn't include all those protected classes we talked about. Doesn't include race, doesn't include religion or your gender or familial status or your marital status or your buying habits or your income or anything like that. Doesn't include education, criminal record. There's a bunch of things it doesn't include. So effectively, any information that is not related to that, it's not going to show up in the personal identifying information section or for that matter, any other part of the report. Okay, so I made this, and if you'd like, we can look at this a little bit. I've thrown this together for Jeff and Dorothy Fake Man. But you can see here, we've got their fake social security numbers. In this situation, we have pulled a joint report for this married couple, for Dorothy and Jeff Fakeman. And we're going to view this as if they're applying for a home loan, right? So if it was just you not applying for a loan, or not having your credit report pulled as a joint, if it's just one person, where it says co-applicant, that would just be blank. Up at the top, you can see when the credit report was ordered and by whom. So obviously, Housing Authority of the County of Lake, that's our official name. That's who pulled it, that's our address. And then when it was ordered. Why is that important? Because sometimes a lender or a landlord or a housing provider will accept a credit report as proof of identity, proof of residency, or they'll just accept it for the sake of getting a trade line, a loan or a house or something like that, if that's within the past 30 days. So let's say this was ordered on 6/15/22. By that time in July, this would be a expired report. So if you have a report, I'm just looking at the rest of the data here. So where it says underwriting alerts, if you have a report that's designated for a mortgage, that might come up. So, you could have something that says, hey, this trade line looks suspicious or what have you. If you're not applying for a mortgage, it's likely to not be them. Okay. So in some capacity whatsoever, your front page is also going to include your scores. So if you're pulling a report with scores, that's where this is going to show up. Now, and I've circled our friend Jeff's scores in purple here. You're going to see a couple of information here. So right here, we've got his scores. We've got circled in red, in yellow, and green who is providing those scores. So in red, you've got the provider, Equifax, Experian, or TransUnion. That's your bureaus. And then next to it, you're going to see your models. So FICO Classic 5, FICO version 2, FICO version 4, and then what the range of those scores are. So, with Equifax, for example, 334 to 818, but TransUnion goes from 309 to 839. So here we go. And then right here where I have circled in orange, what that is effectively a 4 to 5 line explanation of why your score is what it is. So even if you have an 815 credit score, FICO requires the bureaus to list what the reason was, and that the score is not completely perfect. There is no perfect credit score. You're never going to get all the way up to 820, 840, whatever it is. So let's say you come into this game with a 603, you're going to want to know what the reason that it is a 603 versus an 844 or something like that, right? So every person has this, no matter if you have the ideal credit score, no matter how great your credit score is, it's going to list the negative information. So it's not going to say you are superb, you're intelligent, and you're attractive. It's going to say these are the negative reasons that your credit score is not exactly perfect. In Jeff's situation for his Equifax version 5, he's got some delinquencies, he's got some derogatory time, he's got a bunch of accounts, so the number of accounts with delinquencies, and the length of time since derogatory public record or collection is too short, and then the time since delinquencies is too recent. So this, again, everyone's going to have these. You have between 4 or 5, depending on the version that was pulled, and it's only going to have negative information, even though you're, even with the best credit score possible. All right, this is Dorothy Fakeman's scores. So you can see her scores are affected by very similar factors, which are like delinquencies, how soon those delinquencies were, the number of accounts with delinquencies. And then again, because a lot of those trade lines are joint trade lines, this is a married couple we're pretending to look at, it's going to affect both clients' credit scores. All right. So the second section of your credit report is going to be where you're going to find specific details on the accounts themselves, the trade lines, right? So that includes your mortgages, your student loans, your car loans, etc. Again, each individual account is called a trade line. So trade line could be an open account or a closed account. It could be one that's been charged off. It could be one that was included in a bankruptcy, etc. It's going to have the trade lines themselves are going to have the date you open the account, as well as if you have a closed account, when it was closed. It's going to have credit limit, the loan amount, the account balance, your utilization, so many information, right? Maybe your payment history, your delinquency histories. This info is going to make up the majority of your actual credit report. Like as many pages as your credit report is, this will probably be a lot of it. All right, so we're going to take a look at the Fakeman's credit report again. So this is section 2, right? So if you look over the trade lines that are listed on this fake credit report, you can see that each are noted with a series of information, right? So a lot of jumbling of letters and numbers. But we're going to look at the first trade line here circled in red, which is going to be a Freddie Mac mortgage, right? So the account number is going to be listed directly under the lender's name, which is highlighted here in blue. So that's going to be the date when the loan was last reported to the bureaus. This information here is going to be the date where the loan opened, the highest level of credit. So in this case, the highest level of credit with the loan amount, the mortgage amount, the current balance, the terms, which means the monthly payment, and then what amount is past due, and how many times the account has been 30 or 60 or 90 days account due, past due. And then over here where it says Mo Rev, that's the number of months that this particular trade line has been revised. So up at the top where it says Mo Rev right above that red highlight, that's how many months it's been in review. In this case, 99 months, right? So lastly, in the very far right, you're going to see the account type as well as the source of data. So for the trade line that's highlighted in red, mortgage, it's from Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. For credit counselors like myself, this is a ton of information about that trade line. So when we're sitting in front of a digital copy of the credit report, we can click where it says First West. We can click on that and to get their contact information, but this is also listed on the end of the credit report, which you're going to see in a little bit. All right, so let's take a look at a closed account. It's a good example of one. So as you can see, there's several ways to indicate the account is closed, right? In the first line, there's a note saying account closed due to consumer request, right? So account closed at consumer's request, closed or paid account 0 balance. Whereas the second trade line indicates the account is closed because of the notation for the bureau, which says CL as agreed. So the Citibank here and the Citibank NA, those are, believe it or not, the same accounts. And you can tell that because they have, excuse me, they're not the same, forgive me, they're not the same accounts, they're the same lender. But you can tell that because of Citi, the inclusion of Citi. The difference between the first Citi and the second Citi is that the first was closed at the consumer's request, and then the second, that being the home equity loan, was closed or transferred, which probably means it was sold, but it was closed at some point in time with the terms in good standing. Okay. I don't know if you noticed from the Fakeman's credit report, that fake report we've been doing, but basically there's going to be a series of numbers and letters to the left of your trade lines. These are called your WHO's codes or your ECOA codes, and those indicate what type of loan you have and as like what your relationship to the loan is. So for example, on the previous reports we've been looking at the Fakeman's reports, those are indicated by a letter J, which means joint. So both the borrower and the co-borrower are responsible for that loan. A B, of course, indicates a borrower, and the C indicates a co-borrower. Others are indicated by a number or letter where it says the ECOA range in that column, which that could indicate that the person we are running a report for is either an authorized user or a different borrower's account, etc. So most common of these codes are going to be the A3, which is an authorized user, an individual account, a C1, which is individual account but belongs to the co-applicant, or a J, which is a joint account, also called a 2 account. And then, of course, if a person is deceased, you're going to have an X for a deceased account. All right. So at the end of your account summary or your credit summary, you're going to find your collections accounts, right? So, well, maybe you won't. I'm hoping you won't find your collections accounts. But if there's a collections accounts, that's where they're going to be. They're going to be below the trade lines that are open and active. So these follow the same patterns as the individual trade lines, And they're going to include the original creditor or the current collection agency, or they could include both. Oftentimes, if this was a medical bill, instead of the original physician's name or the original hospital's name, it's going to include something called medical payment data. So for the example we have up on the screen, obviously it doesn't say like Dr. Harris, it says medical payment data, and that is because of HIPAA laws. So as medical collections are going to be treated differently between the lenders and the reports, it's absolutely a good idea to identify the original lender for these medical accounts, because that's how you're going to determine if they're valid or not. So this is one of those things why we need to get in front of our collections, especially before applying for future trade lines, because to a point, if this wasn't valid for the fake man's account, why would they pay on it? And it's time to start getting some action together to get this removed from the account. So the collection line, no matter if it's medical or valid or invalid, et cetera, a collections line item is going to include the amount owed. So in our example here, that's $187, as well as how many months it was reviewed, in this case, 23 months, and the date it was opened. So in this case, it was opened May of 2020. So based on these numbers, it is likely the account was first delinquent in April 2020, and was labeled as delinquent 30 days after that, which is May of 2020, and then might fall off the report in June of 2029, whether or not the collections are paid. This is, of course, because delinquent accounts can only stay on your credit report for 7 years, or 10 if you're in bankruptcy. But in this situation, the impact this is having on the credit account will fade over time. But because the borrowers are still in the time frame where the delinquency is still affecting their credit score, it's obviously showing up and reducing that credit score. Another thing to talk about as far as delinquent collections accounts specifically is please keep in mind that the time starts ticking on your 7 years, the date it went delinquent, not the date it was assigned to a credit or credit collections agency, what have you, the date it went delinquent. So even if it was sold 15 times between collections agency, the date that the clock starts is the date it went delinquent. And if anybody is interested in the data on that, or what each individual bureau has on that, we keep a nice little file of those quotes so we can help our clients reinforce their rights. But again, the date it went delinquent is when the clock starts ticking. Okay, Section 3, public records. So public records are going to include things like bankruptcies, foreclosures, tax liens, civil judgments, et cetera, all of which can hurt your credit, right? So this portion of the credit report is typically found above the inquiry section. So, and you know, for many folks, it's blank. So basically, you have your personal data, your trade lines, and then this part. If you have filed for a Chapter 13, Chapter 7, and it's still within the time period that it would, you know, still show up on your credit report, this is where it's going to be found. Obviously, if it's been between 10 and 13 years since you've applied for that bankruptcy and had it discharged, it's not going to show up at all. So if it was discharged and it's still showing up in your credit report, that's going to show up here, as well as typically the case number. And so that will allow your lender or your credit reporting agency to go to the PACER file on your behalf, take a look at that bankruptcy file, and find out if find out a whole bunch of information. It's public record, so that's the truth of it. Information on judgments can also be found here, and that includes the amount that's currently owed, who do you owe that money to, what the date of judgment is issued, if it was sent to collections, etc. So it's important to note too that in Illinois, our state specifically, a judgment can stay on that report for 7 years from the date of entry, unless it has been revised through the court system. That's the biggest part. So at the 7-year mark, when the judgment becomes what's called dormant, it may fall off your credit report, but depending on if the creditor pursues it in court, well, firstly, it can be pursued for 20 years. But if they do decide to pursue it in court, if it's revived, it can go back on your credit report. So just keep that in mind. That's for judgments specifically, and judgments that are not currently being garnished. Okay, we talked a little bit about soft inquiries, hard inquiries, like what shows up where, right? So when I spoke about soft inquiries and hard inquiries, what I said was that all of these, no matter soft or hard, are going to show up on your inquiries tab, right? Inquiries is going to be below public records. So No matter soft or hard, they're going to show up here. So again, a soft inquiry is just for educational purposes or for you to review your account, and a hard inquiry is one where your intent is to get a line of credit or a trade line, etc., a loan of some sort, or a car of some sort, or a utility of some sort. You're going to have a list of who pulled your credit, basically. So in our situation, if it was LCHA that pulled your credit to do a review, it's going to show up on here. And let's say it's one of these agencies as well, like Credit Plus or First USA Bank, something like that. It's going to show up in here, and it's going to have your ECOA code, where we just talked about, like who applied for it. Was it yourself or your partner or whomever it is? That's going to show up on here as well. And this is a good way to know, by the way, who's been looking at your credit as well. So if you don't remember if your employer looked at your credit, or if you don't remember if your housing counseling agency pulled your credit as part of counseling, it'll show up on this place. All right, and then below that, typically at the end of your credit file, you're going to have your creditor's contact information. This includes their phone numbers, what the creditor license number is, as well as their, obviously the name, but then again, their address. Unfortunately, what's not included on this is the medical payment data. So, for example, if you have a collection agency that says medical payment data on it, it's probably not going to have who the original medical provider was. So again, that's one of those things. Medical payment data is a rough one because you really do have to reach out to the collection agency or the bureau to find out who that original creditor was to validate that debt. Okay. All right, so we'll move on to the last section, which is repairing credit, right? So before we do this, I just want to say that most of repairing credit can be done by yourself. There is, to a point, because so much of the repair process is long-term and requires adjustments in behaviors, or just adopting new behaviors many times, it's kind of impossible for an outside agency to do all the work on your behalf. Like, we can write letters, we can guide you, but really the meat of the work has to be done by the individual who's repairing their credit. So in the end, credit repair and growth require time. Time, money, and basically change in how we behave, right? So that being said, there are nonprofits out there and no charging agencies that exist to create long-term spending plans, savings, repair plans, things like that, in order for you to map out a pathway towards good credit. There are many legitimate for-profit agencies as well. There are paid credit agencies, etc., and things like that. I would absolutely advise you to do research when it comes to those agencies, no matter if it is a nonprofit or a for-profit. Make sure you know what you're getting into. Obviously, read everything, and if you need a review, go to a trusted source like your housing counselor or an attorney if you have access to one, etc. And then, of course, you could always look up for-profit agencies. You can look up their accreditations. You can find reviews, etc. And as well, hey, if you want to look up a nonprofit agency, same thing. Look up their accreditations. Make sure they're licensed. Housing counselors have to be licensed. We have to be certified, approved by HUD. So just do your homework. This is a very delicate process. Do your homework. Stick to the plan. But again, most things with credit repair can be done by you, and you don't have to spend your money on it. All right. That being said, on to repairing credit. After receiving your report, the first thing you're going to do is to identify those line items that are inaccurate or that require dispute. So what is inaccuracies? That could mean incorrect identifying information, such as your name, your date of birth, your social security number, your address, your employee, everything that was in the first section, right? But it can also include like closed trade line that should have aged off your report. Again, 7 years after the first delinquency, not 7 years after it was closed. It could be a judgment or a collection that doesn't belong to you. Incorrect trade lines. We had a client my first year here. She was a 27-year-old woman. She was an awesome person, but she had a collection and a judgment on her account for child support, and she had never had children. So it's one of those things that if she had never looked at her credit report, she would never have found out that somebody was actively pursuing her for child support. And really not her, just somebody who had been using her social security number. But nevertheless, so reviewing a credit report is important because you want to identify those things on the report itself that perhaps aren't as accurate as they can be, or just flat out nonsense. Okay. The dispute itself is going to be addressed with either the bureaus or the lending agencies or both. So how do we determine which is which, right? So for information on the credit report that's not specific to a trade line, you're going to want to contact the 3 bureaus. For anything regarding individual trade lines, line of credit or what have you, or maybe it's a judgment, or especially if it's a collections, you're going to want to contact the individual creditors as well as the 3 bureaus. So if it's just personal information, the bureaus. If it's a trade line specific, you're going to contact the person who's putting that information, that lender, as well as the 3 bureaus, which basically means for every 1 trade line, you're sending 4 letters. Okay, so we're going to begin by contacting the bureaus. These things are Googleable. The 3 bureaus haven't changed their mailing address in a zillion years. It's going to be found on all of your credit reports at the bottom. It's going to have your PO box where you can send these things, right? So your TransUnion, your Experian, your Equifax, contact information, it's going to be there. Oftentimes the bureaus are going to want you to dispute that information on their online portals, but it's not a requirement. And some people don't want to do this, as it could be, you might be required to sign up for a service or just put your information in. Whatever the reason is, you don't want to put your information as online, that's valid. They are required to take your disputes and to take your letters via the mail. My favorite tactic that a client taught me was to do it with your handwriting, because that way it has to be looked at by a human instead of a robot or a computer. So that's a neat little trick that we've adopted that I like very much. If you're interested in a sample letter of dispute, we have one that we use that I like. There are a bazillion on the internet. Please don't pay for them. Please don't pay for them. They have to include the same data over and over again, which is effectively, this is my dispute. Who am I addressing this to? This is what it's regarding. This is my dispute. This is the account that I'm being disputed. These are the reasons why it's being disputed. Here is my contact information. You attach a copy of the report. You attach a copy of your ID. You lick an envelope, jam a piece of paper in there, and you send it off, right? So, again, don't pay for it. And there's a lot of people who think there are tricks and things like that. There really aren't. The reporting agencies are very savvy at this point. You basically have to give them the reasons why. You request that it's reviewed or disputed or what have you, and you send it off. Really, the only trick I found that work is that handwriting one, because it actually has to be read by a person instead of a computer. Okay, so regardless, let's just talk about what that means, right? Your identifying information is going to be everything that you are. Your name, your full name, your address, your phone number, if you want to include your email address, etc. Right? What you are disputing, the trade line specifically, you literally write it out, pull it off the report and paste it in. There's many ways to identify it, but as close as you can get to what's on the report, include that in your letter, right? And then when you attach that part of your report, make sure you don't have to attach the entire report, but make sure you attach the part with the identifying information, and then circle or highlight the part of the report that you're disputing specifically. Especially if you are referring to a line item, they're going to want to know what the line item is. Okay, so what happens, right? There is a specific timeline that regulations require the bureaus to take. So the bureaus have to investigate your dispute. They have to forward all the documents to the creditor, the lender, or the collection agency, etc. And they have to report the results back to you unless they determine your claim is frivolous. Obviously, if you're just putting in a nonsense claim, they're not going to do much. If the bureau or the lender determines that your dispute is frivolous, they can choose not to investigate it, as long as they send you a notice that they're not going to investigate within 5 days, saying that they have made that determination. Okay, so if they determine that it is not frivolous, so it is valid, the bureaus have to investigate your dispute within 30 days of receiving it, or 45 days if you dispute it after receiving your free annual credit report. Why is there a difference? I believe it has something to do with the fact that you have paid, if you have paid for your report, so they have to give you a priority, but if you have received it for free, they get that extra 45 days. So 30 days if you've paid for your report, or 45 days if you've received it via your free annual credit report, annualcreditreport.com. So if you submit any kind of additional information during that period of time, so during a 30-day period, if you give them any extra documents or you say, hey, I found this letter, whatever it is, right? Keep in mind that if you do that, that's super duper, that's well within your right to do it, but it can extend the investigation period by 15 days. So on day 29, if I send something in, I no longer have 30 days, maybe I have 45. So during that dispute period, the trade line that you are contesting is going to be marked as in dispute on your credit report. What happens when that is the case is a disputed trade line is removed from the algorithm, from the arithmetic that causes you to have a credit score. What happens is if you dispute something, your credit score is boosted a little bit. So because typically we're not disputing positive information, we're disputing negative information. So when we dispute something, it removes it. And then of course you're removing a negative piece of information, your credit score is boosted. Do with that information what you will. So, but for that reason, because it is artificially boosting up your credit score, you should assume that a lender, anyone who's lending you money for a home, for a credit card, for a student loan, whatever, you should expect that those people are not going to give you that money until you remove those disputes. Specifically, it is industry standard for mortgage lenders to not even look at you until you have those disputes removed, because they know that your score is artificially inflated. Fine. So again, do with that what you want. After completing your investigation, so let's say your investigation is done, the bureaus now have 5 days to notify you of the results. Typically, this is going to be via an email if you choose email, or it's always kind of a letter. So you're going to receive with that letter, you're going to receive a copy of your updated credit report if they have updated anything. And that the good thing is that free report that comes in the mail typically is not going to count towards your annual free credit report, right? So keep in mind that if a company provides the wrong information to a credit reporting company and then corrects that information on your credit report as a dispute, it has a duty to forward that corrected information to the bureaus. So if Chase Bank, if I've disputed something with them and they correct it on their end, it's their responsibility, it's Chase's responsibility to send that out to the 3 bureaus, not Liz Warning's, Chase's responsibility. All right. I know it was a ton of information. We're moving forward. Okay, so what about old accounts, right? Again, we talked about this just a little bit, but I want to restate. Obviously, most negative information stays on the credit report 7 years, sometimes it's 10 years. But so while some variations of credit reports may include phrasing that indicates when the collection will fall off your report, most don't. So as you can see from the report, if you have your own report in front of you, especially the ones we pulled, nothing indicates that the date it's going to fall off your report. So you pretty much always have to do backwards math. So late payments, they remain on the credit report 7 years from the original delinquency date. We talked about this again, the date of the missed payment, right? So what we can do is determine when of these line items will fall off the credit report. You have to know when that was. When is the first missed payment and that caused that negative or delinquency status? So in that circumstance, it is absolutely wise to do 2 things. One, you want to validate the debt, and you want to do that within 30 days that somebody contacts you about that debt. That is the sweet spot. So the first 30 days is really when you have an opportunity to validate the debt and then deny the debt if it is going to, before it goes on your credit report. So the first 30 days, if Chase Bank reaches out to me and says, you are delinquent, etc., before it hits my credit report, I can go back to Chase and I can say, I'm sorry, I'm not, or prove to me that I am, etc. If it's a collections, especially, that first 30 days is crucial, because the moment if you have got a pristine credit report and a collection hits your account, it can decimate your report, you decimate your score. So what you want to make sure is you hit that sweet spot in the first 30 days, ask for the validation, dispute the debt if it's not valid, etc., right? Especially if they can't prove that it is the delinquency date. During that validation point, if you have no intent on paying the delinquent account, If you have no intent on paying the delinquent account and you just want to predict when it's going to fall off, one of the items that you can validate through the validation and dispute process is the date of delinquency, not the date that the credit collection agency purchased the debt, the date it was first delinquent. It is absolutely important to include that on all validation letters, because that way you know when it's going to fall off. So again, there's a lot of hubbub about when it falls off, if it's 7 years from the purchase. Nope, it's 7 years from the date of delinquency. And just because I'm petty, I'm going to read you what Equifax says. So this is verbatim. Equifax says on its website, if you have a late payment and do not pay the past due balances, the account could eventually be charged off by the original lender and assigned to a collection agency. We all know this, right? If that happens, the entire collection account will be removed 7 years from the date of your first missed payment that led to the collection or charge-off status. Same thing. Experience got the exact same thing. You know, they say if an account was to come late today, the payments were never brought current, it was charged off as bad debt, closed, sent to collections, then the original delinquency date will be today's date. After 7 years, that negative information will be automatically dropped off your credit report, even if a collection agency has assumed that debt. So obviously, we're going to side with Equifax and Experian on this one, because they're the people who are actually creating the reports. They're not a man or a woman who works for a collection agency and has an incentive to maintain that delinquency on our account. All right. Okay, so lastly, let's go ahead and talk about collectors, right? So there's a bunch of different types of collections and tactics used when approaching this type of debt. There are a few options, such as to approach the debt, such as disputing, negotiating for a delete letter, paying off balance, or something, just letting it age off your account like we just talked about, right? Before you determine what your approach is going to be, it's absolutely important to know who is asking for the delinquent amount. So the first step is often an internal collection letter from the agency that you owe, the organization you owe, the bank that you owe, the physician that you owe, the doctor, whoever, right? So let's say it's a hospital collections department. Right off the bat, your account is not in collection, right? If it's with an internal hospital collections department, it's not in collections. It is at the delinquency stage right before it hits your credit report, right? So that's the best stage to negotiate, create a payment plan, beg forgiveness from the hospital for medical bills, claim hardship, whatever it is. If it's with an internal credit collection department, now's a good time to negotiate because it has not hit your credit, right? So again, collections are the main reasons that our credit score can dip violently and dip quickly, right? So if you come to an agreement with the internal collections department, the agency will continue to report you to the credit bureaus as doing well for yourself. So only good stuff, right? If you cannot come to an agreement with the internal collections department, that agency, let's say, again, this is a hospital, that hospital agency will then sell your debt to a third-party collection agency who, again, they have to adhere to those laws that protect you, specifically the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, the FDCPA. Again, you don't have to remember that, but just understand that you're protected, right? So that law makes it illegal for debt collectors to use abusive or unfair or deceptive practices. They can't lie to you when they collect your debt. And that we also have to validate the debt if they are requested to do so. They don't have to do it right off the bat, but they do have to do it if they're requested. So let's say that it has gone to a debt collector. That they have bought the debt from the original party. Let's say, again, this is a medical debt, right? They must notify you right away with the information about the account. Namely that their agency, the collection agency, has purchased the debt, from whom, how much, where to send the payment to the collection agency. And then you have, at that point in time, that's that sweet spot we talked about, 30 days from that point to dispute the debt. So this, again, that's the crucial point, right? And this is unfortunately where a lot of folks just fall, because those letters are hard to receive. So we get it, we throw it out. But really, that's the real sweet spot where you have an opportunity to dispute it, right? So the FDCPA, one of those laws, basically says, if within that 30-day period of time, the consumer disputes in writing any portion of the debt or requests the name and the address of the original creditor, that collection agency has to stop all collection efforts until the collection agency mails the consumer, you, a copy of the judgment or the verification of the debt or the name of the address of the original creditor, right? So at that point in time, you can get the hospital's name, you can get the original bills, things like that. It's absolutely important that the moment a collection agency speaks to you for the first time via mail, or phone, whatever, that you start that dispute process and validation process. Okay. So the biggest question, of course, is should you pay to settle a collection? So with everything in credit, this is largely dependent on how old the delinquency is and how much it is and who's asking for the payoff. When you pay or settle a collection and it is updated to reflect zero balance on your credit report, newer scoring models like FICO 9 and also Vantage for what it's worth, they can improve. They may improve. They're not guaranteed to, but they may improve. However, or the older scoring models, which again include 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, so 2 through 8, which again, most lending agencies use 8, FICO score 8, do not ignore paid collections. So if you pay off collections and your lender is using a FICO score 8, it's not going to improve your score. Take that for what it is. So a myth that we hear a lot of course, is that paying in the collection account restarts at 7 o'clock. That's not the case. I can say it 1,000 times. It can't restart the clock. The clock starts at the day of delinquency, not at the year that you touch base with the collection agency or pay on it, right? So unpaid debt does not get erased. The actual unpaid debt, though, for what it's worth, does not get erased after 7 years. It just falls off your credit report. So the date of delinquency plus 7 years when it falls off your credit report. However, it doesn't get erased. Debt is not that easy. You still owe the creditor even when it's too old to be included in your credit report. So even if it's too old to be included in your credit report, you still owe that debt. And then depending on your jurisdiction, they may have a lengthy period of time, even after it falls off your credit report, to still pursue you for that debt. And they may. So please keep that in mind when you're determining if you're going to be paying your collections or not. Okay. So let's focus on a couple of tactics that have the most likelihood to increase our score, no matter who the borrower is, right? So firstly, we're going to reduce the overall debt burden. Obviously, you have to figure out how much you can put towards your debt. You have to really sit down and create a comprehensive income and expense analysis, and that is a whole other workshop that we provide. We also do that services for you. There are so many ways of doing this. You can use a spreadsheet. There are so many amazing apps out there. Please find a way to create a budget, a comprehensive and honest budget. A housing counselor can help you do that. Obviously, this is one of the most difficult things to do because it takes a deep dive into our personal expenses and sometimes the emotional reasons that we spend on the things we do, especially our habits. But we do, it's vital in order to know what we can put towards our debts. So keep in mind when you're looking at your spending plan, remember, again, budgeting has no morality. It's literally just data. So please look at it like data. And secondly, we are the masters of our future, right? So the way we are behaving can determine what our future looks like. And that doesn't mean cut out everything that gives you joy. Please include some joy in your spending plan, or otherwise you're never going to adhere to it. No one could. Okay, so basically, how do we begin, right? So basically, we download or write down everything we've spent money on in the past. Typically, it's 60 days. Sometimes 90 days, depending on what your budget looks like. But effectively, we download all the information about our spending plans, and we create a calendar of when our money comes in and when it comes out, and we have to adhere to it. We have to figure out where all of our money is coming from and tracking it. So that could be, from an employer, that could be from Zelle, that could be from PayPal, 1,000 different places that we could bring money in. And then, of course, if it's consistent, what time of the month it comes in, so we can start planning things around when our bills are due. At the end of the month is the time to really look at what we can put towards savings. And if we're in a situation where we have so much debt that there's no way to budget around it, there are credit counseling agencies. In Lake County, where we are at, there is one nonprofit agency called Consumer Credit Counseling Services of Northern Illinois. We have no formal arrangement with them. It's just that they're the only nonprofit agency around here. So please feel free to look them up if you would like. Consumer Credit Counseling Services of Northern Illinois. So If you have a bank account with one of the larger credit bureau or one of the larger banking institutions like Chase or BMO Harris, they might actually include a personal budgeting tool as part of your accounts. You can do that as well. It might be good to follow those procedures. The only thing about those budgeting apps and the ones through your bank is they're going to have access to your bank to do it. So, you know, if you're not paying for the software, like if you're not paying for Quicken Books or something like that, the way we pay for it is through access to our personal data. So, and again, going through your budget, you might have to determine, yes, what cuts to make, but then what assistance programs you can apply for. Most of the assistance utility programs in this area have a pretty permissive income ceiling. There are not too many rental assistance programs anymore after COVID. But really what you want to look at is every area that you are spending money. So transportation, utilities, internet, your technology, things like that. And then try to seek out assistance programs for that. And again, a housing counselor can help. And then lastly, an increase in income. We have a workshop entirely about decreasing expenses, increasing income. But sometimes the very desperate parts of us, we have to look at that and go, okay, well, I need job training, or I need to increase my income through another source, or take on a second employment, what have you. And again, the housing counselor can help with that. But at the end of the day, the whole purpose of this, of course, is to put that extra income or that wiggle room of current income towards your debts in order to reduce the overall debt burden, to increase your credit score, right? So after you completed that income and expense analysis and identified if you can put anything towards your debt, it's time to make a strategic debt reduction plan, right? So if your ultimate goal is to increase your credit score and come out from under collectors, this is a good way to do it. Obviously, paying down your debts reflects favorably on your on-time payment history. It decreases your utilization rate. It can create a timeline of favorable credit. If your goal is credit growth over time, the absolute least you could be doing is paying your minimum monthly payments on time every month, right? So if you can increase it beyond the minimum monthly payment, contact your credit card company, especially if you don't want to utilize that credit anymore, and ask them to put you on a payment plan after freezing your credit limit. Freezing your credit limit obviously means you don't have access to that credit anymore. So if that is something you're dependent on, you have to consider that beforehand. But again, if you're at a point where none of those tactics work and you really do need to have a formal plan with your credit card companies, going to a nonprofit debt consolidation like we talked about, that would be a good way to work around your debts. So again, this is one of those things that takes time. All credit repair and growth takes time. Even a 30-day late payment will stay on your score for 7 years. So just consider that. Repairing that damage is a 7-year plan. So prevention is the best methodology, but at least going forward, the longest period of time you have to repair your credit to perfection, of course, is 7 years. That's the absolute longest it's going to take. Okay. So you pay on time. You've identified areas where you can pay on time. You can increase your payments over time. Let's look at how we can strategically apply for credits. Let's say we're in a better position now that we can actually apply for credit going forward. So again, we're going to talk about the mix, right? So both the mix of your credit and the timing of when you're applying is going to affect that score. So your credit report should demonstrate that blend of 3 major credit categories like we talked about: installment, revolving, and open-ended, right? A lot of us have 2 of these. Very few of us have all 3. So the most important, the most impactful one is going to be installment. And typically that's the hardest to get because that tends to be the larger purchases like a mortgage or a car loan, right? Auto loans are the most frequent installment type of loans, but there are also some restrictions, right? One product that's worth looking into is called a credit builder loan. So this is an installment loan, so it benefits your credit mix in the same way that a mortgage would do. And it's more likely to be offered by a credit union than a big box bank. So more often, like around here, there's Consumers, there is BCU, there's Great Lakes Credit Union. A couple of credit unions typically offer these. but whereas a Chase may not, right? So a credit builder loan is going to be a little different than a personal loan. It is more like a secured credit card or investment account. Effectively, the borrower makes a fixed payment to a lender over a certain period of time. Typically, it's a year, and then they get access to all of that money. So it's almost like an inverted loan, right? So let's say you put $80 in your account for 12 months. At the end of it, you get $1,000 out of it, etc. Okay, so the benefits are twofold, right? With these situations, one, your credit score drastically increases because you have built your credit mix and you have created a on-time payment for a year. And again, that year is really what we're looking for to improve your credit score over the short term. And then secondly, it's a nice bonus. You've got savings at the end of it. Even if it's $1,000, it's somewhere to start, right? So those can be, credit builder loans can be anything from $500. I've seen as much as $2,500. I have never seen anything smaller than $500. Typically, it's a 12 to 24-month loan, and it's around $1,000. That's the typical I've seen, right? So again, at the end of it, you can take that money and throw it in the street. You can reinvest it. You can buy shoes with it. Whatever you want to do with it, it's yours. If you already have an installment loan, if you already have an auto or a mortgage or a credit builder loan, you can look at your other mix of credits, right? So you can see if you can become an authorized user on an account that's been established for more than 10 years. It's not going to negatively affect the original owner of that loan, and it's only going to benefit you. You can also look at secured credit cards if you like, with your bank to diversify your credit card trade lines. You could maybe add a store trade line as well. It's not going to give you as much benefit as a Visa or a MasterCard or the major ones, but it's still something, right? So if you have no open-ended lines, and again, open-ended are going to be things like your rent or your utilities, see if your landlord or ComEd or something like that are willing to report to the bureaus. Generally, rent and utilities do not appear in a credit report unless they have been asked to be there, right? Or of course, if they're delinquent, then they'll show up. So, however, recently, all three credit bureaus, Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, will include the rent payments on the reports if they receive it. So whatever they'll put there if it's provided to them, right? In fact, FICO 9 and FICO 10 were specifically designed to include that rent data for mortgages. So please look into that. I know that Experian has a product called Boost. I've used it to some success. Our clients have used it to some success. It effectively reports your on-time payments for utilities and other things like Hulu and Netflix. It reports those to the credit bureaus. Again, it's one of those things that you're not paying with your money, you're paying with your data. So you have to give Experian Boost access to your bank accounts. So you got to weigh whether or not that's a thing that you want to do. You do whatever you want with that information, but that is the case. So if you would rather pay out of pocket and not give your personal information, there are products you can buy for like $7 to $10 a month that basically report for you. Again, like I said, you really have to trade between whether you're spending your personal data or you're spending your hard-earned money. Either way, you're going to have to report personal data of some sort. So decide what you want to do. All right. All righty. So let's compare the attractiveness of a good credit credit report with the dangers of applying for credit all at once. This is the dedupe rule again, right? I just want to state this out on Front Street because we get a lot of these questions, especially when people are looking for auto loans, right? So we discussed earlier how a new trade line has the potential to decrease your score immediately after you open the account because it increases the number of new accounts opened within the last 12 months. We also discuss the dedupe rule a little bit, which says that all mortgage, auto, and student loan applied for within 30 days do not affect your score. Outside this 30-day timeline, the inquiries that happen within 45 days have the impact of 1. So if it's within 30 days, no impact. If it's within 45 days, it's treated like it was just 1. So what is the point here besides some very confusing calendar math? I'm not just trying to bore everybody. Basically, the rule of thumb is this. If you want to diversify your credit mix, if you want to decrease your utilization by adding a new type of credit or a new trade line within the next 30 months, you're going to want to do it within the 30-day period, ideally Or if you can't make that happen, within 45 days, so it minimizes the impact. Again, we hear this a lot when people are getting auto loans. There's a common myth that says that when you get a car loan from a dealership, typically the dealership shops around for your loan and that destroys your credit, right? So as you know, the dealer, what they're going to do is they're going to basically apply you to every single thing, and the first one that hits you, that's the loan you get, right? Or they try to get you a loan through their provided banks or what have you, right? So this is especially true for people with lower credit. They typically can find only financing through the dealerships, which is what it is. So while it is true that any major purchase will lower our credit scores, it is not the multiple applications to credit that does that. But most frequently, what lowers your score right after an auto loan is the increase in your debt burden. So how much of that new installation you owe. So what's going to reflect on your credit report is you owing so very much because that debt is very fresh. So you've got a combination of debt burden, you've got a combination of this major inquiry happening in the past 12 months, etc. Right? So there's obviously a lot to say about dealer financing that we don't go into today, but regardless, as far as it regards the credit, even if you apply to 30 lenders through your dealer in one day, your credit report is going to be impacted just minimally because of the dedupe, because of this rule. And again, this is one of those things, please feel free if you have any questions about it, we're happy to talk about it. We're almost at the end, I promise. Okay, so notice we have a question in the chat, so I'm gonna look this up. So, okay, so one of the things says, how do you have the utilities and the landlord report your payments? So there are specific landlord reporting apps that your landlord can use that you can ask. However, honestly, I found it works best to go through the Experian Boost. I don't like to endorse a product, especially when there isn't comparable products. Like if there was one through Experian, Vantage, TransUnion, and Equifax, and there was 4 that we could give you, I would feel more comfortable saying go through your credit reporting agency to report you to utilities. Just because I don't like endorsing a product like that. I will say, however, it has worked with some consistency. So, however, there are landlord reporting apps. What I would do specifically is go to your landlord and say, hey, do you report on my credit? If you like, I'm going to take down your name and I'm going to send you. In fact, I'll send everybody today. Everybody who's registered, I'll send the information on those specific apps. But effectively, your landlord would report through one of these apps. And again, that's one of those things that might end up costing you like $7 to $10 every month, but to a point, it might be worth it to increase credit scores if you've got no other options. But let's see if we can try to find you a cheaper one or a free one. And I'll go ahead and I'll email you afterwards. Does anybody else have any questions? There was another question that says, we can only get one credit report from the credit bureau per year. So yes and no. So we are still within the part where you can request your credit report from each bureau. So TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian. You can say to them during the non-COVID times, and if you're just an average person who is not trying to fight a invalid part on your credit card, or if you're not in public housing, or if you don't receive public benefits, if you're just a person who doesn't apply to any of those things, you can receive one report per year per bureau. So you can do this all at once. Like, let's say you were like me and you ordered your free credit report from annualcreditreport.com every year on your birthday. Let's say you did all 3 every year on your birthday, right? So great. Or you could say, all right, I'm going to do Equifax in January, TransUnion in June, and I want to do the 3rd one in December. You can stagger it like that as well. Again, this is one of those things that you can order online. There is also a way you can order it through through the mail or over the phone as well. And I would recommend, if you're going to do it over the phone or through the mail, though there are risks with that as well. If you do it online, you're going to have to sign up for Equifax for Experian's products and services, and they'll email you relentlessly until the day you die. So, but yeah, you can get one per year per credit bureau as a standard going forward. And then there's always going to be special circumstances like credit repair or validating debt, or if you're on public services, or if it's, if we have another COVID or something like that, I'm sure that's going to happen again. So, yeah. Any other questions? Okay. So, if you ever have the inclination to do so, you're welcome to. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. You're welcome to get a hold of us at LCHA. We are the Housing Counseling Department, and our email is housingcounselor@lakecountyha.org. Let me see if I can get you to our. Here's our information if you're interested. And then again, at the bottom of the screen right here, you have our intake form. But if you Google Lake County Housing Authority Housing Counseling Intake Form, it's very likely that you can pull this up. Our independent one-on-one counseling for credit repair does include a free report with scores as well as analysis, and a comprehensive look at your income and expenses, so we can create a budget for you, including what utilities you might, utility assistance programs you might be qualified for, and everything like that, so we can minimize your expenses and increase income, etc. If you wanted to get a hold of us, please do. But if not, I hope you have a fabulous day, and I hope to see you at one of our future workshops. All right. Bye.